that's something that's very important to him because he's done a very good job in cultivating that locker room, having the type of guys in there that he wants, and going through a training camp and going through OTAs and training camp with these guys, he has a good feel for these men. They've all gone through the same thing. You can bring somebody else in, you don't necessarily know what he did as far as the offseason is concerned, what kind of work he put in the offseason, what he did in OTAs, what kind of work he put in training camp. So, although the player may be talented, may not necessarily be a good fit for your locker room. I don't have a problem with what they did. I think, they do have to figure out a way to get pressure on the passer with 4 without always having the blitz. You want to be able to try to get pressure on the passer with 4. Obviously, we know Aiden is a tremendous talent. He's got a tremendous motor. There's some guys in the other side of the ball that, that can get after the quarterback too, that just need to work a little harder and, figure out ways schematically what they can do, maybe twisting and stunning to get to the quarterback without blitzing, because when you blitz, obviously you're leaving yourself vulnerable in the secondary. But I don't have a problem with what they did with them standing pat. I mean, look, most of the league did. The Dallas Cowboys didn't do anything, and people think a lot of the Dallas Cowboys and their chances of going to the Super Bowl, they stood pat. A lot of the teams stood pat. So I definitely don't have a problem with what they did.
Yeah, we're talking to Melfar Jr., former NFL player, had stints with the Broncos and the Rams. I do want to get your perspective on this because you can definitely give us some insight here in this room and everybody observing. Tell us a little bit about the value of the culture in the locker room. Obviously it's a group of men that obviously are professional athletes working toward a common goal. And here in Detroit, it's obviously being talked about the culture. What type of players, the gritty, hungry type of players that are willing to be able to bounce back. I'm just curious from your perspective, can 1 or 2 bad apples really spoil an entire locker room? Because I think from the outside, you look at it and you say, look, if you already have a culture and you have a strong head coach like Dan Campbell, maybe you take on a player that has talent, obviously like a Chase Young, but maybe you hear whispers that he's willing to kind of go into business for himself or maybe go outside the scheme to do some things. But if you have leaders in the locker room, potentially you can corral that with the common goal of winning. And this is a winning football team that can potentially overcome that. So I'm curious from your perspective, how is it in a locker room in terms of leadership, and how can 1 or 2 bad apples really upset an entire locker room?
Yeah, I mean, you got 2 guys pulling the rope in a different direction. I mean, everybody's got to be tugging the rope in the same direction. Everybody's got to be going the same way, and you have to have tunnel vision. You have to be focused on the mission, the job at hand. And so, yeah, a couple guys can. They always say a couple apples can spoil the bushel. You don't want that. You don't need that. There's enough stuff that you have to deal with on a day in and day out basis that you don't need to add something else to the mix. So, yeah, anytime you can alleviate or eliminate that type of problem in your locker room, the better off your team is going to be, because everybody's, pulling the rope and they're all heading in the same direction. I mean, there's a lot to be said about camaraderie in the locker room. When you leave the game, that's what you miss. You miss the camaraderie that you had in the locker room. Yeah, you miss the games, you miss the crowd and stuff like that, but you miss being around the guys, because all of a sudden when you're no longer a part of the game anymore, you're not one of the guys anymore. You're not there. You're not in the locker room. And that's a special place, and that's a special bond that not that many people get to experience. And it's something that you have to cherish. Some guys may not necessarily appreciate it while they're going through it, while they're playing, but certainly after you leave the game, you have a greater appreciation for that bond that you have with those guys in the locker room.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what Dan Campbell said. They're not going to bring in people. He used the phrase a couple years ago, no turds. They want individuals all with the common goal. But the blessing of having a panel with differing opinions, and different people have different thoughts about it. Joe, we're hearing that you're upset. You're one of those that says, wait a minute, this is a blown opportunity. The Lions had to keep up with the arms race. I mean, I look at that opinion and I understand where some people would say, look, it's the NFL. It's a talent-driven league. And in the postseason, the biggest moments tend to, the biggest players on the biggest stage make the biggest plays. So, Joe, I'm curious. You kind of giving off the vibe that you weren't too happy with what the Lions did.
Absolutely not. I wasn't. Because I look at the 3 general managers that you go against in the NFC. You look at John Schneider, one of the best general managers in football. You look at Howie Roseman, one of the best general managers in football. John Lynch, one of the best general managers in football. They made trades because they made trades to make their team better, no matter how you slice it. And what the hell? And that's you got to move it. Like you got to make the trade. You got to make the moves to help bolster your team. And I didn't see that. I didn't see them make a move that could help their team win in the playoffs, because you look at this team and they need another defensive end, and they didn't get it with that. So that's my opinion.
Okay, Walt, what do you think?
Well, honestly, I think there's a few different ways you can look at it. I think, first of all, when you look at Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes, you got to look at the type of head coach Dan Campbell is, the type of player he was, where he came from. And head coaches like him typically build teams in their makeup. I use Arthur Smith with the Atlanta Falcons as a prime example of a guy who built the Atlanta Falcons offensively in his image, not necessarily to the benefit of winning long term or being explosive offensively, but he built that offense in his image, being a former running backs coach, coming from the Tennessee Titans. And sometimes coaches have a tendency to not be as balanced as they need to be when it comes to building the offense or building a team in general the way it needs to be built. Dan Campbell comes across as a guy who likes try hard, tough, hard nosed guys, lunch pail guys. And that tends to be what he wants to go after as a head coach. Maybe Brad Holmes as well. You look at the San Francisco 49ers, the Philadelphia Eagles. Those are damn well ran organizations. They don't have any issues with guys getting arrested on ESPN every night and this and that. They draft well. They also make moves. They're aggressive in free agency. They're aggressive at the trade deadline usually every year. You see the 49ers went after Christian McCaffrey. I think you have to have a balance. I think the baseball farm system approach doesn't really work in football, where you're just going to draft everybody and grow everybody and pay everybody. It's hard to keep everybody like that. And I think this team is a handful of playmakers away. Because when you compare this team right now to a Philadelphia or to a San Francisco, even though I understand Frisco's having some issues right now with injuries and some other things, defensive coordinator wise with Steve Wilkes, I just question whether or not this team and this roster can line up in January and go beat one of those teams. Um, like I said, you have to find a balance. You have to. You can draft well as you want, but you also have to draft studs. And I think we have a lot of good players, but we don't have too many big time difference makers. Panay Sewell was a top 5 pick. Coming out of high school, he was viewed as a generational tackle. He's probably the only guy on this team that you can bona fidely say is a top 5, top 6 player at his position. Aiden right now, I wouldn't say is one of the 5 best edge rushers in football. You can go to the safeties, you can go to the corners, you can go to the wide receivers. As much as I love Amon-Ra St. Brown, I don't think he's one of the 5 best in the NFL right now. We have a bunch of solid guys, lunch pail, culture guys, try hard guys, but we're lacking some difference makers. So yeah, I was kind of disappointed at the deadline that they didn't make a move, but as they mentioned, a lot of teams didn't make moves. As Mel Farr Jr. mentioned, a lot of teams didn't make moves. A guy like Brian Burns, he was viewed as a guy that could be moved. Josh Allen with the Jacksonville Jaguars. There were a lot of guys who have expiring contracts coming up at the end of this season that did not get moved. So it's not as easy, I think, as people think to just go out and make trades. But at the end of the day, did this team get better? Did they close the gap with a Donovan Peoples-Jones trade on the Philadelphia Eagles or the 49ers or even the Seattle Seahawks? No, they didn't.
Understood. Yeah. And I know that the debate has been real interesting looking at the acquisition of players. Scott Smith writes in, could you imagine Hutch and Max Crosby was my dream trade? And when Brad Holmes walked in a surprise, I thought for a split second, he was going to say, we've acquired Max Crosby. But to be honest, going into it, Max Crosby was untouchable. You know, good teams or teams aren't going to give away their best player unless you make a generational trade. like 3-4 first round picks and players, and the Lions aren't doing that. So with the Lions in their development, I think, Walt, you made an interesting point in that currently they don't have what you would call marquee players, but two of the guys that I think in the future may end up being that are Jamison Williams and Jahmyr Gibbs, combined with Sam Laporta. The thing that is interesting is that this team is young, and what has been kind of the thought that maybe some perspective here is that fans, once they saw the window crack just a little bit of opportunity for the Lions to have success, they just wanted to rush in and go all in, which I understand. When you see the landscape of the NFC, it doesn't seem like there's a super team that could stand in the way. But I think when the Lions look at it, they also are tasked with looking ahead to the long term. You have a young team that you're going to add another draft class and another free agency class to. I think next year is the year that you pinpoint as being a real solid year and have a potential. This is the year, guys. This is a football team that has yet to experience a playoff game together. You don't know what's going to happen when the bright lights are on. You hope it happens at Ford Field because the chances of success go up. But I don't think the Lions were ready yet with this crew to just go all in. And I think fans are definitely within their right to feel like Joe and feel like, man, we didn't keep up. I'm curious. Spirit of Detroit, what did you think of it all? And do you think that you can be patient and wait one more year for these young guys like a Jamison Williams and a Jahmyr Gibbs to get some more traction under their belt and have more experience to be able to make those big plays in those big moments?
Yeah, I'm going to be nice about it because it's a family show. I think that, fans got ahead of themselves. And I think Brad Holmes has shown you, okay? He has shown you in the last three drafts, the last three free agency cycles, he has shown you that he is a money ball system guy. He's the same guy who trotted out Rashad Perryman and Tyrell Williams and told you that was your X and Y receiver. He's the same man that gave you Robbie Coleman at cornerback. Okay, he's the same man, and I don't think that behavior is going to drastically change. And the only reason that we have individuals such as like C.J. Gardner-Johnson, who are talented like dogs, is because he kind of played himself out of a contract with Philly. He wanted $13-14 million a year from Philly, and they weren't going to pay him that. And the Lions was the only one left. So I don't think his behavior in the last 3 years is going to change. He is going to be a money ball guy. He's going to be a farm guy, and they're going to hide behind the role player lunch pail criteria that they've set. Because when you look at a player like Khalif Raymond has a 90% catch ratio. So 90% of the time he's catching the ball. They signed him to an extension. His extension, almost $6 million for another 3 years. That's pennies compared to the Devontae Adams of the world, compared to what Amon Ra is going to be making. You still have to control this roster. You have 60 to 80 million, depending on where the salary cap goes next year. You still have to sign JG. You still have to sign Penei Sewell. And you're not out of the woods yet. So I think this team wants a divisional championship, wants a playoff win. And if they could rock with what they got, which is the money ball system, which is the go-to-work Pistons or go-to-work Lions of Detroit, if they could win with that, I think they'd be all set. I really do.
Now, let me challenge your thinking here one iota here, because this is the way in which some would also view it. You look at it and you say year to year, it doesn't guarantee that next year the Lions are going to have success. And here's why. You're going to play a first place schedule. You're going to have natural attrition. Maybe you're forced to move on from a Jonah Jackson. JG is going to command probably north of $45 million. So that means the makeup of this team could be different. So when people said, you know what, if there's an opportunity to add 3-4 players, go all in. Brad Holmes came from the Rams, where when they smelled their opportunity, they pounced over 2 years and gave up for 4 years first-round picks. So they looked at it and said, you know what? looking at the scenario around the league, Eagles can be had. Hurts is dealing with some sort of knee situation. They've lost coordinators. They're not as dominant. The 49ers offense, you got a young quarterback. You look at Seattle, and if you have a decent defensive line and a pass rush and can stop a mobile quarterback, you can beat up on a team like Seattle. So what's your reaction to those that said, like Joe or others that said, hey, wait a minute, you missed your chance. The window of opportunity is now. Let's handle business right now.
Well, I gotta turn it to Joe Chap. That's beautiful. Look at that face.
So look, I get what Spirit Detroit's saying. I get what Walt's saying. I get what Mel's saying. I get what John's saying. But there is a team in Buffalo that thought this was going to be the year for them to win the Super Bowl. Tre'Davious White goes down. Oopsie. Matt Milano goes down. Oopsie. And now they have no shot to win a Super Bowl. So you can't say, oh, next year is the year. Because next year you could have Aiden Hutchinson get hurt. You got in the NFL, you are literally one injury away from your season derailing in a jiff. You literally are one injury away. So when I look at them, yeah, there's probably not a lot of deals to be had. I mean, we heard Brian Burns was going to get traded. He didn't get traded. We heard Daniil Hunter was going to get traded. Nope, Minnesota traded for Josh Dobbs because they think they're still alive suddenly. But obviously, you could have got Chase Young, but what Michael Silver was reporting about him taking plays off and looking for splash plays, I don't think that goes with the Lions' mindset. I would have liked to see Brad Holmes a little more aggressive because I think that's what the great elite general managers do. You look at Howie Roseman, like I said, John Lynch, John Schneider, they all made moves to bolster their team. And those are the teams that you're competing with. And you look at the Seahawks. I know Leonard Williams isn't nothing to write home about at all, but
they can't compete with those teams. They can't compete with none of those teams. They don't have the firepower. I
think you can compete with those teams, though. Did you think the New York Giants were going to compete win the Super Bowl over the Patriots? No, because the NFL playoffs are okay. Let's just put it this way: when you go to the NFL playoffs, you go to the NHL playoffs, you go to the Major League Baseball playoffs. There is weird shit that happens all over the place. The worst team can win the Super Bowl. The worst team can win the Stanley Cup. And the worst team can win the World Series. So while you got a shot, you got to freaking take it.
You can't always depend on weird shit, though. But
like the Arizona Cardinals in 2009.
I just think that it's hard though because I don't see them beating a team like Philadelphia or San Francisco unless you have those caveats that come into play. A Jalen Hurts is hurt, or an AJ Brown is out, or a Bosa is out due to a knee injury or whatever. You have situations where we've seen teams in the past go on playoff runs simply because the competition had issues. But if we're talking about Detroit, right now, lining up with those teams, I just don't see it, man. I can understand it from both sides of the table, why they would stay put and why they didn't. Because as Joe mentioned, a team like Buffalo just got stale. I think they're going to eventually move on from McDermott. I thought they did a poor job, honestly, of building that offense around Josh Allen. I think they depended on Josh Allen way too much. And, if you look around the rest of the NFC, Atlanta's coming. Regardless of how we may ultimately feel about the Falcons are a very talented roster. They're coming. Bryce Young with Carolina. On a year-to-year basis, you have zero idea who's going to be good and who's not. So, to Joe's point, I completely understand going for it when you feel like you have the ability to go for it. But was there just one player out there that would have turned us into a Super Bowl contender? Maybe not. But the idea, I think a lot of fans have that, well, we're mortgaging the future if we go and get one guy. No, how is it mortgaging the future if you go get a 23-year-old stud? Well, we're not talking about going out there to overpay for some 28-year-old edge rusher or a 29-year-old corner. I heard people that wanted a Dory Jackson. Why would you want a Dory Jackson? Simply because he's cheap? And that's kind of what bothers me about this fan base. They just want cheap. And
they Brad Holmes guys.
But that's not the way you win in the NFL. Well, the Patriots did it. No, the Patriots had Tom Brady. That's the caveat.
That's the caveat.
And there's no such thing as, well, we'll just pay the quarterback